we can believe that we can be traumatized by something and we can still be transformed by it. Or despair and growth can coexist. And when we start to live in that belief, it leads us to look for different things also, because if despair is just its thing and growth may not ever happen, then we look for all the despairing things in our situation and we tend to focus on those. If we're able to embrace the ampersand, it may be that we can be in despair, we can be in pain, and we can ask, is there something I can learn in this place that will help me grow?
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, and today we would like to invite you to join us for Debbie Laaser, the director of Faithful and True, in her conversation with Leigh and Steven Brown from the Unlocking Love Summit. They had a wonderful conversation not long ago in which they talked about betrayal trauma and post-traumatic growth. Here now is a podcast with Debbie Laaser and Steven and Leigh Brown from the Unlocking Love Summit.
Hello, everyone. My name is Steven, and this is my wife, Leigh, and we are here at the Unlocking Love Summit, and we have with us today Debbie Laaser. Debbie Laaser is a licensed marriage and family therapist and was involved in recovery with her husband, Mark, for over 30 years. She and her husband, Mark, co-founded Faithful and True, a Christian counseling center treating men struggling with sexual addiction and their spouses. Debbie has facilitated therapy groups, individual counseling, and intensives for betrayed wives for over 20 years. She authored From Trauma to Transformation, Shattered Vows, and co-authored 7 Desires and a Toolkit for Growth with Mark. She also published research, Post-Traumatic Growth in Relationally Betrayed Women, available on their website, faithfulandtrue.com. Since Mark's death in 2019, Debbie continues to counsel and direct the growth of Faithful and True in the Minneapolis area. And Debbie, it's so good to see you again and have the chance to talk with you again. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, like-minded colleagues. I love that.
Debbie, I'm so excited to jump right in. I would love to start off with touching on this idea that you have. You talk about the ampersand, which is both and. What does that mean to you in relation to infidelity and recovery from betrayal trauma, post-traumatic growth? How do you use that term?
Okay. Well, sometimes when I'm working with new clients, I actually show them an ampersand, see my sparkly one.
I love it.
Because sometimes people are like, what are you talking about, an ampersand? But it is that symbol on our typewriters here that we use to mean A-N-D. And we love this concept of faithful and true because what we realize is that most things are very complex. Pretty much everything, really. Life is complex, and yet we tend to want to make it into black and white statements or beliefs. And when we do that, we do simplify the situation, and oftentimes it doesn't represent the real truth. So the ampersand, the both and, simply means that we're holding two things that may seem actually opposite of one another, and yet both of those things are true. So an example, for instance, of a wife who might have just come to me might sound like, I'm just really confused because I really love my husband, but he's done all these horrible things and I don't know what to do. And I might say, well, the conjunction but is one that really means we can negate the first part and then we'll just go with the second part. However, when you look at the truth of the situation, from my own research, what was true of 75% of the women who stayed in their relationship, even with betrayal, was that they loved their husbands. So it may very well be true that she loves him, and what he's done has been very difficult for her. Both of those things are true. And when she holds both of those, it might allow her just to set one aside for a minute while she works on the other side, or vice versa. So that's a good example. However, when you find yourself in life, I think in general, because life is complex, when you start using the both and, I think you set yourself up with other people to be safer and more truthful about what you're talking about. You know, many of us, for instance, again, in terms of betrayal issues, maybe before you were even married, someone might have said, well, if I ever marry someone and if they ever do such and so, I will leave. You know, that's very black and white. And yet, for a lot of us, even though we hadn't expected our stories to include betrayal, what we have found with new information, new resources, is that what did happen, and I chose a different path because I know some new things now. The ampersand is very powerful. And actually, when I wrote my latest book, From Trauma to Transformation, I start out the book talking about the ampersand and inviting the reader to go through my book thinking about the ampersand in many situations. It might be that you love your children and there are days when they can drive you crazy, you know, that could be true too. And to say one without the other simply doesn't really speak the truth about the situation. So it is so powerful to people that come to our workshops and work with us in counseling. We've even had people gone and get tattoos on their wrist or their fingers to remind them. Sometimes it's a little embarrassing around our counseling center. We have more ampersands and sometimes crosses, but we also believe it's a very spiritual concept, in that even our faith journey leads us to God, you know, three in one with the Holy Spirit and Jesus. And it's not so simple even there. You know, we're invited to include the both and of all those things.
And I absolutely love that, because I think what our minds typically tend to do is instead of saying and, we say but.
But
Like
yes.
you said,
Yeah.
and the but always results in this kind of canceling of the first, like you had mentioned, and
Right.
by switching that to and, it allows both to be present, both to be true, both to be alive
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
be known,
Mhm.
and as you're saying that, I know, I hear that, and I can see that experience in Lee's experience so much,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I can see how both of those things could be present of, I love my husband, but I am really hurt by what he's done. I'm really angry at him. How, I just want him to leave, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
And all of that being present at the same time. And I was curious as well, too, from a betraying partner's perspective, how might the ampersand be relative to that in that situation from a betraying partner's perspective as well?
Well, I was just thinking, I bet you have many of those same things. Like, I want to tell you the truth, and I'm afraid you'll leave if I do. Wouldn't that be one of the basic ones, perhaps? That is why lying happens for any of us, you know, that sometimes I don't quite tell the truth, say, to someone, because I believe if I do, they will be too anxious. I'm thinking about my mom, who I go visit. She's 104. She often asks me, how was my drive from Minneapolis to Chicago area? And even if it's horrible, and I've gone through snowstorms and whatever to get there, do you know what I'm always going to say? It was really good, because I'm afraid if I say it was really snowy and hard, and you are worth visiting no matter what the weather is. And I have told her that. And unfortunately, she gets very anxious, and she'll start wanting to direct my trips and say, you're not coming in the winter anymore then. We're not doing that. You know, there's that black and white again. And I try to return with my ampersand statement is, Mom, you are worth driving through some hard weather sometimes. And I'm also very mindful of when I need to stop and take care of myself. That's another ampersand statement I would use with her. But you see,
Yeah.
without the ampersand, we're tempted to go to that black and white place and just choose part of it, which usually is not the truth, the whole truth anyway, and we'll give the other person a partial truth, or we might be calling that lies in our world, right? So ampersand helps us to all be more congruent, really, with what we're thinking and even feeling. Our feelings are also ampersands in that we rarely just feel one thing, like we're not we have our clients and our group members generally start in with telling us how they're feeling. And in the beginning, they often struggle with even knowing how they're feeling. And as they get better at it, they might just be one word, well, I'm sad today. As they get more used to that, though, it's almost always an ampersand because feelings are complicated. Again, we hold the tension of, I'm a little hopeful today and I'm also hopeless. It's a real dichotomy, and yet it can be true. And so, or we can be somewhat joyful. I have something going on that's really giving me joy, and I could also be sad at the very same time. So figuring out how to hold these tensions and talk about them, the ampersand allows us to do that in just a really simple and beautiful way. So we always encourage people to try it out. It sounds a little, like you say, Stephen, a little awkward at first because we're so used to using the word but. Um,
Yeah.
and it's really fun when we start to use that. And I think we feel more congruent in how we're talking and what's really true for us when we do that.
Um, I absolutely love that. I mean, just hearing you say all that was like so validating. And like
True.
like kind of clears up like a lot of confusion because it's like, how do you feel hopeful and hopeless at the same time? Well, I know that I have
Yeah, that's
and
right.
haven't been able to really understand that. It's been very confusing, but I love how simply you put that and how validating and reassuring it is to know that like that's okay.
Yeah,
And by
it is.
using the and instead of the but. And
Yeah. Mm.
did you have something?
I mean, yeah, that's especially after betrayal, right? It's so important to realize, within yourself that two seemingly opposite things can be true. And there's so much freedom in that. And like you were saying, it helps us know ourselves better. And then as a result, we become safer, right? We
Yeah.
become safer for other people because it's not so like, as you said, it's not so black and white, like it has to be this or this. It's, oh no, I can contain, and maybe not just two, maybe there's 10, maybe
Yes,
there's 20,
absolutely. Yeah, it could
right?
be an and.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. And one of my most favorite is really to do with our belief in post-traumatic growth, that we can believe that we can be traumatized by something and we can still be transformed by it. Or despair and growth can coexist. And when we start to live in that belief, it leads us to look for different things also, because if despair is just its thing and growth may not ever happen, then we look for all the despairing things in our situation and we tend to focus on those. If we're able to embrace the ampersand, it may be that we can be in despair, we can be in pain, and we can ask, is there something I can learn in this place that will help me grow? And that is, in fact, what post traumatic growth is about, how to transform those really adverse, traumatic life experiences. And we all have them, whether they're huge or small, they accumulate over time in life. And so, learning for me at least how to look at trauma from an ampersand perspective has led me to continually ask that question. I wonder what it is you have for me to learn today, God. Even just today, do I need to slow down with something? Do I need to let go of something or surrender? Do I need your help to try to change something I'm not particularly good at, or try something? It just helps me to continue to ask that question on the growth side of the ampersand, not to deny the despairing side, because that also needs its attention and work to feel the feelings of despair so that we can open ourselves up to growth.
That's so beautifully put, because I think so many of us get caught in that false belief that I can't look for the growth in this circumstance until
Mhm.
I'm all the way through the despair and it's done,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But when you're bringing them together, there's so much of a shift there in terms of embracing the whole human experience
Right.
and really bringing that opportunity for healing and for growth in
Yeah.
sooner, right? It doesn't have to, just because I'm experiencing despair doesn't mean I can't also look for what I am meant to be learning, right? At the
Yeah,
same
that's
time.
that's really well said too. And an example of that would be a wife that came to me once and said, my husband is really doing a lot of good things and he's working a good program. And I would like to affirm him I'd like to be an encouragement to that. But I'm really afraid that he'll think that maybe he doesn't need to do so much work anymore, then that I've arrived and, I'm getting over this and he doesn't need to take it so seriously. So, what am I supposed to do with that? And I said, well, do you see yourself as an encourager and an affirming person in your life? Is that something you want to be? And she said, well, of course. And I said, and is it true that your husband is doing some really good work? And she said, yes, he really is. And I said, well, what if we put this ampersand between those two thoughts instead? And I said, so what if you said to him, you know, honey, well, she might not be calling him honey yet. I don't know. That was my word for Mark. I just want you to know I really appreciate all the work you're putting in to being a new person and taking sobriety seriously. And sometimes I'm afraid if I do that, you might think you don't need to do any more work, or that I'm good and I'm over all of this. And that's not really a truth. So that ampersand just says it so perfectly, and it allows her to be the person she wants to be and grow into, as well as to state her fears about it. So both get to be said. And I think she's like, oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want to say. And she did. And she felt so much better about herself than if she had said nothing. And then she didn't get to grow in a way that she knows represents who she is, which would have been sad for her. And he wouldn't have gotten to hear an affirmation, which we happen to believe is important for all of us as we're doing good things, that we can affirm one another. It helps us to stay on track, for doing those things.
I'm wondering if if we were going to transition into talking about something that is seemingly so black and white, this topic of triggers.
Mhm.
Does the ampersand apply to that too? Can
Yes.
we be overall triggers and also, right? Let me put it this way. Can we be moving forward in our recovery and still experience triggers?
Oh, there you go. Yes, you perfectly can. And probably for those that get well, I believe they will get very good at this. First of all, triggers are an emotional reaction to something going on in your life. And I think it's good to be reminded that as long as you're breathing and living, you will have triggers. Everybody will. As my husband always said, the triggers are the gift that keep on giving. So it's true, they will be there. Unfortunately, when we've been through something hard or traumatic, our triggers will often be related to those things. And if we're not careful, we might want to go to that place where we want to avoid them if we can. We want to deny them. We want to get the person out of our life who's creating them, or something dramatic like that, rather than what I say is, I would like to help teach you how to interrogate your triggers. because triggers in my mind are always telling us something about ourselves. And if we look closely, they will also lead us to a need that we have. Most people haven't thought about that. They just think about it as being a feeling that is very uncomfortable and they want to get it out of their life. What if, though, we decide that triggers could actually, in the book Mark and I wrote called Seven Desires, we talked about this, and I named them anointings. What if we were to call them anointings, like I'm going to learn something more about myself if I would interrogate my triggers, which will eventually lead me to what I need, which I might need to ask for of another person, or I might need to attend to for myself. I bet you want an example, so let me think of one here.
Well, yeah, I
Or do
mean,
you
and
have one?
I've come to see them, in my process of recovery. Triggers are kind of like arrows pointing to what I need to pay attention to within myself, right?
Right.
But like you said, I did not see them that way at first. It was like, oh no, avoid that feeling, right?
Yeah.
Avoid, like that's not happening for me. That's happening to me, right?
Yeah, right.
And then, that shift in like, it's not that they're not uncomfortable. It's just, if I can reframe, like, and I'd love to hear more about interrogating and what you mean by interrogating the trigger.
Yeah.
But for me, reframing that is, arrows to what needs healing within me, or
Yeah,
what needs more
think
attention
that's
from,
Mhm.
from me towards myself.
Mhm. I'm going to teach you the simplified method of this. However, for those that want even more explanation, it is in Mark's and my book called Seven Desires, where we work through Virginia Satir's iceberg model. I don't know if you've ever been, introduced to that, but there are many layers underneath the behavior that happened that created our initial trigger. And those layers of the iceberg are under the water, so to speak, tell us a lot about what we're thinking, feeling, needing, believing, what's true about us, others, and so forth. So it can be very good to do that kind of interrogating over time to really understand ourselves. But I'm going to give you the shortened version because I know we don't have a lot of time. Basically, the very, very, very short version of a trigger is, what do you need? What is that trigger telling you need? I had a woman, for instance, that said, my days are just ruined because I get triggered every time I go past this restaurant that my husband told me he met this woman at, and they kissed in the car or whatever they had done. And she said, it just sends me off to ruminating and thinking about that. And then I start hating my husband and I have a horrible day. And it triggers me every single day. And so I said to her, what do you think you need? And she goes, I have no idea, other than I don't want to be triggered. And I said, well, could I suggest a couple of things? Oh, yeah, she would love that. I said, well, what if you took a different route to work? And she goes, oh, I suppose I could. And then I wouldn't have to go by that and get triggered. And I said, it seems like that would work. And she said, I think I'll try that tomorrow. And next time I talk, she goes, she's been going a different route ever since, so she didn't have to be triggered. Now, that's one thing that she could do to try to avoid it. It doesn't tell her a lot, though, about herself yet, but it was a simplified way to look at it. I said, if we want to go a little deeper, what is the story in your head, is what we call it. What are you thinking about when you get triggered by this restaurant that you see? And she goes, well, the story in my head is that my husband met some woman and she was probably pretty and young. I don't know the details, but the story in my head is I probably can never be what she is to my husband, and I'll never be enough, and that he probably loves more about her than he does about me. And I said, well, that would create a huge trigger, wouldn't it? I said, what is true about you? She goes, well, I thought I was the love of his life, but maybe I'm not. That's one of my truths. So I say to her, so what I'm hearing is you struggle with believing in your own belovedness. Is that right? And she goes, yeah, that's true. And I said, is that an old is that an old belief you have of yourself? And she goes, well, it certainly got triggered when my husband shared this stuff with me. But, actually, it has always been a problem for me. My mom was on me all the time about what I weighed, and my friends sometimes dumped me for another friend. And sometimes I have struggled with believing in my own belovedness. And I said, what if that's teaching you something about something you could work on while you're waiting for your husband to work on his things and be able to talk to you about root causes of his behavior? What if you worked on God's truth for you, which is you are fearfully and wonderfully made? And no matter what others are saying or doing around you, that is still a truth of who you are. And she said, I would love to feel that on a daily basis. I said, well, how about if we make that our goal for right now for you? That's a good example of going a lot deeper and her exploring and examining something she might want to work on for herself, so that living loved, as Lisa Turker says in a lot of her books, is where she's going to show up in life rather than coping with not always feeling enough, because that's what we do when we don't feel like we're enough or we'll never measure up. We end up coping in ways. We lie to, tell people we think we're better about ourselves than we do, or we don't talk and for fear that we'll say something stupid, or we dress in ways that hopefully help us feel better about ourselves or whatever. So living loved and really going after that belovedness is a huge interrogative piece that I think is important for all of us to go through, actually, men and women. I think the men that come to us have also chosen ways to cope with not always believing they're enough either, and that just looks different. Could have flipped into an addiction, as well as some other things. And so in a way, we have that in common, I believe, from our own surveys here of people that we work with. A good example, though, of how a trigger can teach you, if you want to explore it, something you need. I had just another example, because this is a very common one, is for women who are triggered from not feeling safe. So it could be that, what would be their situation? It could be that their husband keeps blaming them for who they are, what they've done, for why he does what he does. And that becomes a huge trigger, creates a lot of anger. And as I said, that's another layer of exploring this, is what do you feel when you're triggered? Because our feelings lead us to our thoughts. And when someone feels angry or anxious in this case, the story in her head was, I don't feel safe because no matter what I do, you're going to blame me for what you choose to do. And so I ask her, what do you think you need then? And sometimes the answer might be, I need to create my own safety, and I need to not listen to that anymore because I don't believe that's a truth for me. I've heard it all over the place that I didn't cause this for him. And I don't believe that I am the reason why he uses sexual acting out to medicate his own emotions. And I said, well, if that's the case, what can you practically do to create safety for yourself? She said, well, I'm going to ask him to stop blaming me first. And if he won't do that, then I think I'm going to choose to leave, or I'm going to ask him to leave until we can create more safety in how we talk to each other. So that would lead her to a next step of what she's going to do. I like the idea of when someone says, I don't feel safe, I like for them to get more specific. Safety can be about a lot of things. So in this case, it was how she was being talked to, or emotional safety. Some don't feel physically safe. Some don't feel spiritually safe. Maybe they're using scripture to demand that, she has to submit in the marriage, or listen to what he wants, or have no voice in the marriage. And so there are lots of ways that women don't feel safe, and true for men too, I know. So again, a trigger can lead you to what you need for your next step. which I think can be very helpful when we sometimes struggle with that. The whole process is so big. We have a hard time knowing sometimes what just the next right step is, not the next 50 steps or the next month's worth of steps that we need to take. Is that simple enough, do you
Oh,
think?
that was perfect. Yeah. I mean, and you created this perfect kind of segue into what I wanted to ask you next, which I wanted to touch on slowing down and surrendering. And then you just brought it up in terms of, because if you're going to I would assume that the process of pausing, slowing down, really taking a look at what I need from this, what I'm being shown from the trigger. When you're in that sort of like frantic, just get through your day, trauma response, fight and flight, it's
Right.
seemingly it's pretty much impossible to do that.
Mhm.
So why are slow down and surrender your two favorite words in recovery?
Well, you kind of hit it on the first one, slow down, because it's true that as we're triggered, typically there is something current, but probably also something historical that's attached to it. If I have safety issues today, chances are I've also have some from the past that piled on, and they're all showing up at the same time. And therefore, our response is going to be fight or flight, no doubt, because that trigger comes up through the brainstem and it sits in our limbic system, our emotional system, which responds in terms of fight or flight. That's just how our brains have been developed. And if we've had a lot of trauma around a certain issue, that will happen even faster. And if we haven't healed some of that from the past, then we add more of it on in the present, we even have a bigger problem. In order to get to what we call the limbic system, or our thinking brain, our executive brain, to make wise decisions, we have to move through all the trauma of that emotional stuff in the limbic system to get up there, to get to the cortex in our thinking brain. And that takes a little more time than just the response to a trigger. And therefore, if we don't slow all of that down, we will generally live in that very reactive place in our life. And people like that as well as yourself. There are certain things that come up like we're just bulls in a china closet. We can't help our response. And yet we can, if we're able to name it and know what it is, know what the trigger is, know how it's impacting us and what we need, because there are lots of therapies today that can help us work on calming that brain reaction. Even more so, however, I love the slowing down process because of my spiritual life. And I really believe that the Holy Spirit lives within all of us. We've been told that scripturally. The Holy Spirit will be there to our left and our right. We'll hear that quiet voice speaking to us about our next right steps. Sometimes that comes through feelings and thoughts too. I just know that the more time I spend in silence, I mean real silence, not with soft music, not with the radio on, not with the football game with the volume turned off. I mean silence. What I find is that the Spirit is speaking to me pretty regularly. And I love that, because that is one that leads me to know what my next right step is. And it can be very small. It can be knowing that my body is asking me to sleep more. I just got over the flu a couple of weeks ago, and I realize I'm impatient. It's been 2 weeks. I say, you should be over this stuff. And yet my body keeps saying, you got an hour? Would you lay down, please? And I hear that when I'm quiet. And I hear sometimes, just go do your own work. If your husband isn't working on his, you could still work on yours. And so I hear these voices and I let them lead me. Now, a lot of people would say, well, how do you know it's not just your own agenda? And my response to that is, what I have learned is that when God really is part of this speaking to us on a regular basis, if we're not in line with what he wants for us, he will be like that GPS on my phone that says, at the next corner, you take a U-turn and you go the other way. Try it this way instead. He'll correct it. I really know he'll course correct us immediately. And we'll know that because our peace is disturbed. I love that statement that I've kind of come up with to describe it for myself. When I try to do just my agenda, even though I believe it's been the Spirit speaking to me, if it's not on the mark, my peace will be disturbed. And I go back to listening and I course correct with what I've heard. And when my peace is there, even a small piece of peace today, I know that I'm in line with where God wants me to go. I love that we have these internal things in us that lead us. And yet we are such a fast-paced world and we're so hurried that it's a rare time to take that silence to really listen. You know, we talk about, oh, I took 5 minutes to do my devotions this morning. Well, that's a good start. And I'm sure he'd love a little more time than that, you know. So and we all struggle with that, I know. And I'm in a period of my life where I can do more of that, thankfully. And which is where I think I've validated what I have hoped to be true, that if I do more of it, I will hear more of it. It will direct me to more of it. And I have more peace and joy in my life. And that's exactly what's happening. So, surrender, what does that mean? I do believe that we're called to do what we can. We're human beings, we're earthlings, we have a lot of skills and talents, we can do a lot of things. I don't think God wants us just to pray, sit on the couch, and wait. You know, I just don't. And I know I have scriptures that back that up, and I'm horrible at remembering addresses, so I don't have that today. However, in my well marked up Bible at home, I do. And it just reminds us, do what you can and then turn the rest over to me, because I have so many more great ideas, says God, than you will ever have. You're an earthling. I'm your heavenly Father. I have so many ideas. My creativity is beyond what you could ever imagine. And I love believing and trusting in that, because I might do everything I can do. I think of sometimes trying to help my children when they're struggling, and I do all those mom things, and I help and I advise and I, you know, on and on and on. And you know, maybe nothing changes. And I think, you know, God, today I just want you to know I've tried this and this and this and this and this, and I'm just frustrated within, and I know it's time to give it over to you, to surrender it. I just want you to know you take over. I know you have, you know, this person I'm talking about, I know you have better ideas than I ever would have. And so I'm going to let go right now, and I'm going to let you. And what is amazing is in time, and it's not always like that afternoon or that week even, but in time, I start seeing how he shows up to solve these issues. And that, I think, is what creates great joy for any of us, and trust that God is a living, working, present God in our life who really does hear us when we ask for things. And he knows we're at the end of our rope. But, you know, he wants us to know you're not at the end of your hope, because I'm coming in now to help you out with the rest of this. That's what I mean about surrender. Do what we
Yeah.
can, then let go. So I always say, this is what I've said in workshops sometimes. I don't know what made me think about it, but we got talking about tattoos somehow. I don't know how that came up in the women's workshop, but I said, you know, at my age, I'm not really into tattooing, because, you know, things start sagging and dragging. And I kind of hate to see what this might say, but I think if I were, I would put slow down over here and I'd put surrender over here, because they're such important words to me. So that's really what I like to teach about those two words.
And I think that it's so important. I love the way you break down surrender. You know, I think, you know, early in our recovery process, we heard, you know, surrender, let go, let God. We're like,
Mhm.
what are you talking about?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, right, right.
and I love the way that you explained it, you know, and it's so simple. You just focus on what you can do,
Mhm.
and whatever happens is gonna happen, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's a little scary, but
Mhm.
we want to control the outcome of what our life is going to be after having just exited a very out of control time.
Mhm. Mhm.
And So I really love the way that you broke that down, and I think that that's going to be really helpful to a lot of people. So thank you for that. And I know we're kind of running short on time. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that's on your heart that you'd like to leave the audience with today?
I never want to leave an audience or a client without hope because I believe that hope is what keeps us all helping others in this world. I think most of us have been in the trenches, so to speak, for a time, and thankfully have maybe been led to resources and other people, other community who are safe to talk about anything, whether it's shameful or embarrassing or whatever. And that has led us to a great amount of change in our life. And I do believe that ultimately facing into difficult life circumstances and God allowing that, shall we say. I think what is true is he is all powerful and he couldn't, but I think he knows that difficult things, if we will look for what it is he wants us to learn and how he wants us to grow up spiritually, which is James 1, 2 through 4. That's my, my verse that I live by. But I do believe he has many ways he would like to grow us up spiritually. And maybe one of the most important ways is depending on him and not on ourselves for what we believe we need and how we will get there. I think our desire to be smart people and independent people overshadow his great wisdom of please, 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 would you trust in me first and foremost, that I've got your back? I want good things for you. And what I know in watching people and in clinical work myself with post-traumatic growth, it all fits together. It all does. It all is telling us out of despair, there can be growth. Out of trauma and transformation can exist together. And I think it helps us to, while it's hard to get through difficult things, know that it won't always be like that. And it can lead to some amazing new life for any of us.
Thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that this conversation between Debbie Laaser and Leigh and Steven Brown from the Unlocking Love Summit has been helpful to you. We hope that you will reach out to our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find over 550 additional podcasts like this one. We also would like to invite you to take a look at the information about our 3-day intensive workshops. Every month we host the Men's Journey Workshop, and then on 3 times a year we also host the Women's Journey Workshop for the spouses of those men that struggle with sexual addiction. And we also have 2 different formats for couples workshops. So check that out at faithfulandtrue.com. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week for you will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.